We have to find a way to talk and have dialogue and be tolerant between other views.
You have to have open dialogue, and that's where free speech is so important.
Consent's a very important thing, and today in the Me Too movement, it's been very important because I think it's really opened up a lot of eyes.
I think we should get away from this hookup culture and get back to relationships, because when you have a relationship, you have that communication, you have that connection.
If you committed sexual assault, doesn't matter when it was, you should be held accountable for that. However, we have to make sure that we actually make sure they committed sexual assault, and we have to make sure that all allegations are verified.
They'll put in these programs thinking that it'll help everyone, but what they forget is that the pathway to hell is paved with good intention.
And I think that's what this whole movement is all about anyways, is trying to be open to ideas.
Welcome to the Liberty Talks podcast with Michael Anderson and John Douglas. Today we have a special guest with us, pro-life activist Emily Berning.
Emily, it's so great to have you here. Just last week, me and Michael were talking about abortion and kind of the different sides of it between the conservative and the libertarian. And one of the first parts we disagreed on was where life begins. And so that's what I want to get into in the course of this interview. But first, before that, tell us more about you, who you are, and how you became pro-life and what got you into activism.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my pro-life activism when I was in college. My degree is in biology. And I don't know, something about the pro-life issues just stuck to me. And I became a full-time pro-life activist for about a year. And now I am pursuing a medical degree to be an OBGYN. It's been a really exciting journey. And I've learned a lot along the way. And I'm able to go and travel and talk to a bunch of different groups. It's pretty awesome.
Tell us about some of the places you've traveled to. Where have you been? And tell us some of those experiences.
Mm-hmm. So I've been all over the world with my pro-life activism. I went to Ireland for a month back in May during the Save the Eighth campaign. My husband and I brought a team with us, team of about 10 people, to do activism there. I've been all over Michigan to a bunch of different universities there, Colorado, you name it, just so many different states. So
Great. Well, I just want to jump right into the questions. Now, like I said, one of the first things me and Michael agreed on were where life begins at. So tell us, Emily, where do you think life begins at?
Conception.
Conception, why is that?
Easily. So at the moment of conception, there's something very unique happens. Right before conception, you have a sperm cell and you have an egg cell. And at the moment of conception, you no longer have just a sperm cell and just an egg cell. You have a complete human being that has all of the DNA that they will ever need to grow and become the person that you and I are today. So it's very scientifically sound, in my opinion. At that moment, it too ceases to be, and you have a unique human being.
All right, and so one argument I often hear a lot is that life starts third trimester. So what is the difference between the third trimester and conception? Why does life start at conception? What is that point that's different from the third trimester?
A lot of people, I think, attribute humanity, if a person is a human being or not, to if they look like you and I. So if they have qualities and distinctive features that look like you and I, maybe earlier in development they kind of look like a tadpole or something like that, and that doesn't really scream human to some people. So a lot of people attribute humanity to the later stages, the third trimester, or even birth. A lot of people don't think it's a human being with rights until after it's born. However, it is human being. Inherently, it's human being because of its DNA, because of its genetic code that is different from every other organism. It was made by human beings. The last time I checked, a man and a woman can't produce, like a cat. So it's human being in nature. And so I think that's an important distinction. And it's not about the size, the level of development, the environment, or the degree of dependency. It's the fact that we are innately human.
All right. And last time Michael brought up some pretty interesting questions that I think deserve to be talked about.
So different things I was speaking to John about was we were talking about being pro-life and how much to an extent we were. John's a little bit more conservative and a little bit more libertarian. I brought up the idea of saying possibly life could start at heartbeats and or brain waves, some other type of function where you get closer to having a fully developed human being or almost fully developed human being. I was saying probably closer to the second trimester. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So first, I would like to say that the initial kind of primal heartbeat actually begins 2 weeks after conception. So that's kind of something really cool. Science has really progressed, which I think is amazing. It's giving us a window into the womb, essentially.
I didn't know that, so awesome. That's really great to hear.
So,
now.
I mean, it's pretty soon, and at that point, you may not even know you're pregnant. So it's pretty quick. It's not, the heart isn't formed yet, but it's that initial kind of primal, like I said, primal heartbeat. So I gave this story to John actually the other day. And a lot of people talk about, well, you know, I think life begins when the heart beats or when there's brain waves. But for me, it always goes back to the fact that we are innately human and we are on a directed path. It's self-directed. So when you have an embryo, a zygote, you know, it becomes a fetus, it's self-directed. Everything it needs to grow and become like who we are today is there. Nothing outside except for an environment and maybe some nutrients is needed to let it progress. So the analogy I make is that we're all on a safari and, you know, there's like a cougar, right, that I really want a picture of. It's super rare, and I have my Polaroid camera, and I see it, and I snap a picture of it. And the Polaroid camera comes out, you know, white and blank. It just needs a couple minutes. And I show you guys, and you're like, there's nothing there, and you rip it up. And I'm like, Michael, John, oh my gosh, you just ripped up my picture of this rare cougar. If you just gave it like a couple minutes to dry out, you would have seen that it was there.
Like a fully developed human.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It just needs a little bit of time. So heartbeat to me doesn't necessarily make the human. It's what's already present. It's like the blueprints are already there.
That's really interesting. You know, I've never really heard it explained like that. I think that makes a lot of sense, and you make some pretty valid points. The way in which I was explaining it to John was I said, you know, I don't know a 100% way to measure life. Like, how do we measure? The scenario was, how do you measure death? Through brain waves and heartbeats, right? So that's how I imagine we could measure life in a medical way. I couldn't come up with anything else besides maybe more of a philosophical idea that life starts at conception. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's definitely a valid argument. I've heard that a lot. You know, if our heart stops beating or, you know, our brain waves aren't there anymore, that determines death. Shouldn't that determine life? I've heard that a lot, and it does. I mean, it is a very valid argument. This is what I'll say. We can ask the question all day, is life there? Is it not? I mean, you can get down into some dark black holes of philosophy and relativism and do human beings even have value and all that stuff?
I think they do.
Yeah, and I think so too. I think so too. I guess a good analogy that I can make is if there's even a tiny bit, like a tiny potential that it could be a human being, that there could be a human being inside the womb, I think it's better to err on the side of caution. So my example is, like, let's say you're a pyro, Michael, and you just love setting things on fire, and you see this like house and you want to set it on fire. You probably want to check inside to see if there's human beings there first before you set it on fire, because then it's not just like you lit something on fire, but you also killed people. It's the same thing that I think of with abortion. You should probably check to make sure something's there. One of the Supreme Court justices in Roe v. Wade said, because we don't know if it's a human being or not, that gives you a right to kill it. And my argument is, because we, quote unquote, don't know, a lot of people say we don't know when life begins, I think we should err on the side of caution. And so that's my kind of argument to that. You know, when does life begin? Well, even if we don't know, we probably should wait to see, because human life is like pretty valuable. So.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I just have a few other questions, but first I really want to thank you for like taking the time to come speak with us. For the listeners, we literally just like hopped in the studio real quick to do an interview, and Emily was like, for sure.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys did this.
Yes. So thank you again. A few questions I want to go into is one more of a philosophical one, the other is more back on kind of the policy of abortion. Mm-hmm. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that there's there's a good argument to be made that like humans are superior to animals and that human life is more intrinsic than other life. Would you agree, and how do you see that as someone that's pro-life in comparison to, like we're talking about the life of a human or a baby or, even possibly just a small organism of one or a few cells? How do you differentiate that between the life of a puppy or an animal or just another organism that's just a few cells?
Sure. So there's a couple of things I'd like to hit. First of all, I guess I'll clarify, and I'm trying to use this term a little bit more than pro-life, because when I say I'm pro-life, people say, well, are you pro this and this and this, all this stuff? And I'm like, okay, let me clarify. I'm anti-abortion. So a lot of people have talked to me about lives of animals. So I'm actually a vegetarian, but I'm not like one of those PETA activists. Like my husband hunts all the time. Like I don't really care. So I'm someone that does believe that humans are superior. I mean, there's just so many reasons for that. And human life is intrinsically valuable. Like I'm not going to go out and hunt animals because I just like feel really sad about it. But I don't think that they're on the same level as humans, if that answers your question.
No, I think it's actually great. And I really appreciate you really making that contrast and just being straight up like, hey, I'm anti-abortion. Because me as a libertarian, I consider like pro-life for me as being pro-life on abortion, being anti-death penalty, and pretty damn close to anti-war.
Yeah.
If you have those same ideas, you could tell me. We don't have to go super into that. But, is that something that you see or?
Yeah, so I'm actually against the death penalty too. And with war, I think there are certain circumstances that warrants war. However, when I'm like out tabling or doing pro-life activism, it's like almost 100% of the time surrounding the issue of abortion. So I like to clarify for people that I'm debating with that I'm specifically anti-abortion because my goal in life, I'm trying to be an OBGYN. My goal is to really minister to the women and their children and unborn babies, like all the fetuses, right? So I try to clarify that because then we get down this like black hole of the death penalty and all these things. But it is kind of fun when I have someone like a liberal come up to me and say, well, then you should be against the death penalty. And I'm like, well, I am. So it actually turns out, and then they're like, well, you should be against the killing of animals. And I'm like, well, I'm a vegetarian. So it kind of trips them up. But it's definitely just kind of narrowing our focus. And yeah.
That's awesome. I really appreciate the conversation. You're someone that the whole reason why we made this podcast is to kind of have these conversations, to find enlightenment, to talk to people maybe we agree with or maybe we disagree with, just to find their points of view.
Yeah, it's an important conversation to have. And I think especially when you could do it with a level head, it's really awesome. It can be really good.
Yeah, I agree. Making sure you can talk really in a good conversational voice, make sure we're not wanting to ride and rip each other's heads off. I think that's really important to civil dialogue and debate. And I actually have some questions I want to ask you about abortion because I've heard these questions before, and I think these are really hard for a lot of people to answer. So is there any gray area in abortion? For example, if a woman is raped, do you think she should be allowed to get an abortion? What's the arguments for that or against that? Absolutely.
So I don't think there's a gray area. I think abortion is black and white. That's pretty much my plain and simple answer. But on the topic of rape, it is a horrible tragedy when a woman or a man, but in this case, being able to get pregnant when a woman gets raped. Yeah, it's really, really sad, and that must be a very difficult thing to have to deal with. I mean, there's so many psychological and emotional consequences of that. Can't be easy to deal with at all. And then, of course, you add on the burden of, right, people say you get pregnant. Oh, my gosh, like that must be something that is just hard to deal with. And so this is a topic that I really approach very compassionately because you don't want to make anyone feel like they did something wrong or just invalidated. So with the issue of rape, it comes back to the question of either human beings are valuable or we're not. So I can talk about two sides of this issue. There's the biological side, and there's also kind of like the more philosophical side. The more philosophical side is, let's say I had 4 babies with me, just like 4 random babies, and I put them all right here in front of you guys. And I didn't tell you anything, but I said, look at them and point to which one was conceived in rape. Could you guys tell me?
I don't think so.
No way.
There's no way, because they're all human beings. And in my opinion, when you come into existence, you are a new human being with a new life that is on a completely different path. You do not, your value of life doesn't all of a sudden become diminished because of what your father did if your father was a rapist. I know actually a lot of people that were conceived in rape, and I think their lives are just as equally valuable as mine, and I was not. So I think that's something to consider. Another thing, why compound more psychological and emotional trauma on top of a rape? I mean, so many studies, so many statistics. Abortion, literally, your body knows you're pregnant. You have hormones, you have endorphins, you have all these things going through, you have oxytocin. I mean, there's just so many things happening in your body. And when your child is taken from your womb, your body knows it. It knows it. And there's no way that you can avoid that. So you now have to deal with the rape, and you have to deal with the abortion. And that's really sad. And that's why there's post-abortive counseling and post-abortive healing. And that's something I'm really passionate about as well, because those women need help too. So
I would agree with that. And I think that life is really important, that life has intrinsic value. And that's why this next question, this is the question I've always struggled with the most. And it is, I know statistically this is, and with modern medicine, this is almost cannot really happen anymore, but there are still cases out there, I believe. So what do we do if a woman is pregnant and the baby has a chance of killing her? How do we cope with that? What should we do about that?
absolutely. So I think this is one of the most go-to arguments. I think it's kind of a lame excuse for an abortion, in a trying to be kind way here, but a lot of people say, well, she needs an abortion to save her life. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Dr. Anthony Levatino. He's a former abortionist. He's performed over 1,200 abortions. He's actually a part of the organization I work for now, the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs. And he discusses about how abortion is never medically necessary. So let's say there's a car accident, okay, and I'm a doctor and you guys both get in the car accident and you both are laying on the road and you're both suffering. What I have to do is try and save you both, okay? So the goal of the doctor, when a woman comes in and she's pregnant, he has two patients. He needs to try and save both mother and baby, okay? The difference between a doctor that does that and loses a patient in the process, like let's say the fetus dies because of a procedure they had to do, not because they went in there and removed the fetus. So the difference is, let's go back to the car crash example. I come and I have a gun and I say, I have to save John's life, so I just shoot Michael. But I don't even try to help you. And you died because I shot you, not because I tried and you didn't make it. So that's the difference. And it's the same, it follows for like ectopic pregnancies when the embryo implants in the fallopian tube. There's no way for the fetus to ever move down to the uterus or to survive. The mother will also die. The fallopian tube will rupture. So what happens is the doctor goes in, cuts out that portion of the fallopian tube. They never do anything to specifically remove the fetus or the embryo. They never do anything to get rid of it. They have to do a procedure that removes the fallopian tube. And in the process, the embryo dies. And that's really sad, but it's not the intention. So that's kind of where, and Scott Klusendorf talks about it in his pro-life apologetics books as well. So I think that's the most important distinction, is that abortion is never medically necessary.
Wow, that's a really good point. I haven't actually thought about that. And that just leads me to one more question. And a lot of people say this is some gray area. I personally disagree with this, but I would like to hear Michael's opinion on this too, because I don't know if we've talked about it. But how do you feel about abortifacients, like the morning after pill or Plan B? Is that considered abortion, or is that contraception, especially when it's the day after when someone has sex?
Absolutely. If there's birth control that has abortifacient properties, I'm completely against it, because I think at the moment of conception, if anything is done to intentionally harm that embryo, I do think it's murder. I think you're taking a life away that would normally progress. You're putting a stop to it. With the morning after pill, here's the thing. When a woman ovulates, the egg is only viable and alive for 24 hours. The morning after pill is available for up to 72 hours. So the problem with that is, I feel like if a woman takes the morning after pill, 2 days, 3 days after she has has sex, has intercourse, there's definitely like potentially a life there. And like I said, it's like with the house burning example, like I said before, if there's even a potential, if there's even a possibility of a human being there, I'd rather not risk it. So as an OBGYN, I will never prescribe any medication that has any abortifacient properties.
So even if it's 24 hours?
Right.
All right. And how do you feel about that, Michael?
We actually had a conversation about it.
Yeah,
I asked you.
Yeah, I believe you asked me, but I don't think we had enough time to get into your beliefs about it.
The idea that I had was I kind of took like a drug war approach to an economical approach, but with my stance of saying I think there's a line we can draw somewhere between the first and second, and with my ideas of possibly brainwaves and heartbeats, I'm not as much against abortifacients. But something I do want to make clear is I think, you, John, specifically, but also you, Emily, you guys have given me a lot to think about. Whether life begins at conception, and like John said last podcast, if you're pro-life but you don't accept the premise that life starts at conception, you're kind of setting the rest of your argument up to fail. So you guys are really giving me a lot to think about. My mind's going to be going 100 miles per hour on this for probably the next week or so to try to figure out what I think is the most principled stance. Sure. But right now, I'm pretty okay with it. But I really appreciate both of your insights, and I think it's just amazing that we can come together and have this kind of conversation without throwing terms like baby killer or like you hate women and stuff like that into this. So yeah, I mean, we definitely have a lot of common ground and have some different stuff, but you guys have given me a lot to think about, to say the least.
Plant to the sea, that's all we do.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Emily, for coming on. Where can people find you if they want to know more about you?
Absolutely. You can find me on Facebook, or I have a pro-life organization called Let Them Live, and that's on Facebook as well. You can like us there, send us a message. We reply all the time, so.
Yes, and that's Emily Berning with B-E-R, right? Not burning like you're burning something,
yeah,
right?
B-E-R, yep.
Awesome. Just for the listeners, go check her out. Go like and share the podcast, and check us out next week on Liberty Talks Podcast with Michael Anderson and John Douglas.
Thanks for listening.